The radar operator's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the cathode ray tube, watching the green phosphorescent blips materialize against the dark screen. It was 11:47 in the evening on March 9, 1945, and Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto had seen this pattern dozens of times before. Small formations of American B-29s approaching from the southeast, probably another precision strike against the Nakajima aircraft plant, or perhaps the port facilities. He counted the returns carefully, his trained eye tracking each luminous point as it crawled across the oscilloscope. 8 aircraft, maybe 10 at most. Nothing they couldn't handle. 8 B-29, he called out to his superior, using the Japanese designation for the American Superfortress. Bearing 135 degrees, range approximately 200 kilometers. Altitude appears standard, likely 7,000 to 8,000 meters. Captain Hideaki Matsuda nodded from his position near the plotting table, where junior officers moved colored markers across a large map of the Tokyo metropolitan area. This was the 4th raid warning this week, and the pattern had become almost routine. The Americans would send a small formation, anywhere from 5 to 15 bombers, flying at 25,000 feet or higher where Japanese fighters struggled to reach them effectively. They would drop their payloads, usually high explosive bombs aimed at industrial targets, and return to their bases in the Mariana Islands. Damage was significant but manageable. Fires could be contained. Casualties, while tragic, remained within acceptable parameters for a nation at war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Lieutenant Yamamoto didn't know, what Captain Matsuda couldn't have imagined, was that every assumption built into their training, every intelligence estimate carefully compiled over the previous 4 months, every confident assessment of American bombing capabilities, all of it was about to dissolve in the most catastrophic single night of urban destruction in human history. The Air Defense Headquarters sat deep beneath the streets of Tokyo, a concrete bunker designed to coordinate the city's response to aerial attack. The room hummed with the sound of radio equipment and the low murmur of officers communicating with fighter squadrons, anti-aircraft batteries, and civilian defense units scattered throughout the capital. Maps covered every wall marked with the locations of military installations, industrial zones, fire breaks, and evacuation routes. Everything was organized, categorized, prepared. Tokyo in early 1945 was a city that had learned to live with the threat from above. Since the first B-29 raid on November 24th of the previous year, the massive American bombers had become an unpleasant but familiar presence in Tokyo's skies. The raids followed a predictable pattern: high-altitude approaches, precision bombing during daylight or early evening hours, formations rarely exceeding 20 aircraft. The damage was real. The Musashino aircraft engine plant had been hit repeatedly, and various factories and port facilities bore the scars of American bombs. But it was damage the city could absorb, repair, and continue functioning despite. Japanese intelligence had worked diligently to understand the B-29 threat. The aircraft was formidable, they knew. A 4-engine heavy bomber with a range exceeding 3,000 miles, capable of carrying up to 20,000 pounds of ordnance. But intelligence estimates suggested that the Americans were constrained by several factors. The distance from their bases in the Marianas meant long flight times and limited sortie rates. The precision bombing doctrine the Americans favored required clear weather and daylight conditions, limiting when attacks could occur. And perhaps most importantly, intelligence assessments indicated that B-29 production couldn't possibly support massive simultaneous raids. The Americans might have 100 of these bombers available for operations against Japan, perhaps a few more, but certainly not enough to overwhelm Tokyo's defenses in a single night. These assessments weren't mere propaganda or wishful thinking. They were based on observed raid patterns, calculations of American industrial capacity, and the established doctrine of strategic bombing that had governed Allied operations in Europe. The Americans believed in precision, destroying specific military and industrial targets while minimizing civilian casualties. This approach required smaller formations that could maintain tight bombing patterns and required bombers to fly high enough to avoid most anti-aircraft fire. It was rational, systematic, and based on everything the Japanese command had observed, the way the Americans made war from the air. Captain Matsuda had internalized these patterns so thoroughly that they had become second nature. When the alert came through about approaching bombers, his mind automatically began the standard response sequence. Alert the fighter squadrons at Yokota and Chofu airfields. Bring the searchlight batteries to readiness. Ensure the civilian air raid wardens were prepared to direct people to shelters. Coordinate with the fire brigades. 8 bombers meant perhaps 160,000 pounds of high explosive ordnance, likely targeted at a specific industrial complex. Significant, requiring a full response, but nothing approaching an existential threat to the city itself. The Japanese home defense system had been refined over 4 months of B-29 operations. Fighter squadrons flying modified Ki-44s and Ki-61s would attempt to intercept the American bombers, though reaching their typical cruising altitude of 25,000 feet remained challenging. Anti-aircraft as batteries would create a curtain of flak around probable targets, forcing the bombers to fly through a gauntlet of exploding shells. Searchlights would attempt to cone individual aircraft, making them vulnerable to fighter attack. And if bombs did fall, an elaborate civil defense network of fire wardens, water brigades, and neighborhood associations stood ready to contain the damage. It wasn't a perfect system. No defense system ever is. But it had proven adequate for the threat as understood. Monthly casualty reports showed deaths in the hundreds or low thousands from air raids. Terrible for those families affected, but sustainable for a nation of 70 million people. Industrial damage was being countered by dispersing manufacturing into smaller facilities scattered throughout the city and surrounding areas. The Americans were hurting Japan, certainly, but not in a way that suggested imminent collapse or surrender. Lieutenant Yamamoto continued monitoring his radar scope, tracking the approaching formation. The returns remained consistent with his initial count. 8 aircraft, perhaps 9, if one of the blips represented 2 bombers flying in close formation. They were maintaining their course toward Tokyo, now about 170 kilometers out. Altitude was harder to determine precisely with the available radar equipment, but the returns suggested something lower than usual, perhaps 7,000 meters instead of 8,000. Possibly the Americans were trying a different approach angle. Fighters scrambling from Yokota, a communications officer announced. 6 Ki-44s airborne climbing to intercept. Searchlight batteries report ready, another officer added. Anti-aircraft crews at assigned positions. Civilian defense units acknowledging the alert, a third voice called out. Air raid sirens activated across the eastern districts. The machinery of defense was functioning exactly as designed. Captain Matsuda felt the familiar tension that came with an impending raid, concern for his city, determination to minimize damage, confidence in his team's ability to respond. But not fear. 8 bombers didn't inspire fear. 8 bombers was a tactical problem to be solved, not a catastrophe to be endured. Outside the bunker, across the sprawling metropolis of Tokyo, millions of people heard the air raid sirens and began their practiced response. Families gathered emergency supplies and moved toward designated shelters. Fire wardens donned their protective gear and took up positions with buckets, pumps, and sand. Factory workers prepared to evacuate assembly lines and protect critical machinery. Neighborhood associations ensured that elderly residents and families with young children were safely moving toward shelter. Everyone had roles, everyone knew the procedures, and everyone had survived these raids before. The city spread out below the approaching bombers covered. Nearly 220 square miles, home to roughly 7 million people. Most of Tokyo's buildings were constructed primarily of wood and paper, traditional Japanese architecture that had evolved over centuries to accommodate earthquakes and monsoons. The narrow streets of the Shitamachi, the low city where craftsmen and merchants had lived for generations, wound through dense neighborhoods where homes pressed close together, separated by gaps sometimes measured in mere inches. These areas were known to be vulnerable to fire, which is why the city maintained an elaborate system of fire breaks. Wide boulevards designed to prevent flames from spreading between districts. The American B-29s that Lieutenant Yamamoto was tracking on his radar screen had left their bases on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan hours earlier. The crews had been briefed on a mission unlike any they had flown before. Instead of the usual high-altitude precision bombing, they would attack at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, low enough to improve bombing accuracy dramatically, but high enough to avoid most small arms fire. Instead of high explosive bombs aimed at specific factories, they would carry M69 incendiary cluster bombs, each aircraft loaded with approximately 7 tons of fire. But Lieutenant Yamamoto knew none of this yet. His radar screen showed 8 aircraft, and 8 aircraft meant a conventional raid following conventional patterns against a conventional target. He watched the blips progress steadily across his scope, now 150 kilometers out. 15 minutes, perhaps 20, before they reached Tokyo airspace. "Lieutenant," a junior radar operator called from an adjacent station, "I'm picking up additional returns behind the first formation. Range approximately 240 kilometers. Yamamoto frowned and leaned over to examine the other operator's screen. There, indeed, were more blips materializing out of the electronic noise. He counted quickly. 7, 8, 9, possibly 10 more aircraft. A second wave, then. Not unprecedented. Sometimes the Americans sent follow-up formations an hour or so after the initial attack, trying to catch fire crews and rescue workers exposed in the open. "Second formation detected," he reported to Captain Matsuda. "Approximately 10 aircraft, same heading and speed. Estimate 20-minute interval between waves." Matsuda nodded, making notes on his clipboard. 18 to 20 bombers total. Still manageable. He issued orders to keep the fighter squadrons airborne longer to maintain the anti-aircraft alert, to inform civilian defense units that a second wave was following. The command center settled into its practiced rhythm of coordination and communication. But Lieutenant Yamamoto was still staring at his radar screen, and something wasn't quite right. The returns from the second formation were stronger than they should be at that range, suggesting either the bombers were flying lower than normal, or there were more of them than he'd initially counted. He adjusted the gain on his set, trying to resolve individual aircraft more clearly. "Captain," he said slowly, "I believe the second formation may be larger than I first reported. The radar returns are—" He stopped. On his screen, behind the second group, a third cluster of returns was beginning to emerge from the noise, and these were even stronger, suggesting a much larger formation. "Sir," Yamamoto said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "we have multiple formations inbound. I'm counting." He paused, studying the screen intently. "At least 30 aircraft in the third wave, possibly more. They're stacked in sequence, roughly 10-minute intervals between formations." Captain Matsuda moved quickly to Yamamoto's station, staring over the lieutenant's shoulder at the radar display. The green blips marched across the screen in 3 distinct groups, the third group showing a density of returns that suggested many more than the 8 aircraft of the first wave. Range to the lead formation? Matsuda asked. 120 kilometers, approximately 10 minutes to Tokyo airspace. And these additional groups? You're confident in the count? The third formation is definitely larger, sir. At least 30 aircraft. I can't get an exact count with our equipment at this range, but it's significantly beyond anything we've seen before. Matsuda straightened, his mind racing through the implications. 50 bombers? 60? This was far outside the established pattern. This was... Captain! Another radar operator's voice cut through the room. I have multiple large formations at extreme range, bearing 140 degrees, range 300 kilometers. Sir, there are dozens of them. The scope is filling with returns. The command center suddenly went very quiet. Every officer turned to stare at the radar stations, where both operators were now working frantically to count the incoming aircraft. The plotting table officers stood frozen, their colored markers forgotten in their hands. Lieutenant Yamamoto felt his chest tighten as he watched his radar screen. The initial 8 aircraft that had seemed so routine, so manageable, were now revealed as merely the vanguard of something vast. Behind them, formation after formation was emerging into radar range, wave after wave of American bombers converging on Tokyo from the southeast. I need accurate counts, Matsuda said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that Yamamoto had never heard before. Not fear exactly, but recognition that something fundamental had just changed. All radar stations report continuously. Communications, inform all fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft batteries. We have a major raid developing. Yamamoto kept counting, his practiced eye tracking each return, trying to resolve individual aircraft from the clusters on his scope. 20 in this wave, 30 in that one, 25 in another. The numbers climbed steadily, impossibly, far beyond any estimate of American capability that Japanese intelligence had produced. Sir, I estimate at minimum 150 aircraft inbound, he reported. Possibly significantly more. The formations are still emerging into radar range. 150. The number hung in the air of the command center like smoke. Tokyo had never faced a raid of even 50 B-29s simultaneously. 150 would deliver. Matsuda did the calculation quickly in his head. 3 million pounds of ordnance. 30 million pounds. Enough to devastate multiple districts, overwhelm every fire brigade in the city, render the carefully planned civil defense network meaningless through sheer scale. But even that number, staggering as it was, underestimated the reality now approaching Tokyo through the night sky. Because what Lieutenant Yamamoto was seeing on his radar screen, what was making his experienced hands shake slightly as he adjusted his equipment, was only the beginning. The first B-29 of the lead formation, carrying Pathfinder crews and target markers, was now 90 kilometers from Tokyo. Behind it, stretched across 160 kilometers of night sky in a long stream, 334 B-29 Superfortresses carried 2,400 tons of M69 incendiary bombs toward the sleeping city. Each cluster bomb would break apart after release, scattering 47 individual bomblets across the target area. Each bomblet contained napalm gel that burned at 2,000 degrees. The simple mathematics were terrifying. 334 aircraft times 7 tons of incendiaries times 47 bomblets per cluster times 2,000 degrees per fire. But Lieutenant Yamamoto didn't know this yet. Neither did Captain Matsuda, nor anyone else in the command center. They knew only that their assumptions about American capability had just been shattered. that something unprecedented was bearing down on their city, and that every procedure they had practiced, every defense they had prepared, was designed for a threat perhaps 1/10 the size of what was actually approaching. "All fighters to maximum alert," Matsuda ordered, his voice cutting through the shocked murmur that had begun to fill the command center. "Anti-aircraft batteries to full readiness. Civilian defense. Initiate immediate shelter protocols across all districts. This is not a routine raid." The command center erupted into controlled chaos as officers raced to implement orders that suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. How do you defend a city against 150 bombers when your entire defense doctrine assumes 20? How do you contain fires from millions of pounds of ordnance when your fire brigade is sized for hundreds of thousands? How do you shelter 7 million people when you have perhaps 30 minutes before the bombs begin to fall? Lieutenant Yamamoto continued tracking the first formation on his radar screen, watching the 8 aircraft that had started this entire chain of realization. They were now 70 kilometers out, 5 minutes from Tokyo airspace. Behind them, the sky was filled with American bombers. He had counted 8 aircraft on his scope. The actual number approaching was 334. The discrepancy between those two numbers, between the routine and the catastrophic, between expectation and reality, between what intelligence predicted and what was actually happening, would define everything that followed in the next 3 hours. Tokyo was about to discover the difference between fighting a war and facing annihilation, between enduring strategic bombing and experiencing an inferno deliberately engineered to consume the heart of a city. The Ki-44 fighters from Yokota Airfield climbed through the darkness, their pilots straining to gain altitude for the intercept. Flight Lieutenant Koji Nakamura pushed his throttle forward, coaxing his aircraft upward through 6,000 feet. Then 7,000. His squadron had scrambled expecting to engage a handful of American bombers, routine work that his 6 fighters could handle effectively. But the radio chatter from ground control was telling a different story, one that made no sense even as he listened to it. "All fighters, be advised. Multiple large formations inbound. Estimate exceeds 100 aircraft. Repeat, estimate exceeds 100 aircraft." Nakamura keyed his radio. "Ground control, confirm count. Did you say 100? "Affirmative. Radar indicates massive raid developing. Additional formations still emerging at range. Engage targets of opportunity. All fighters cleared to attack at will. 100 B-29s. Nakamura tried to visualize it and couldn't. His squadron of 6 fighters against 100 bombers? They could make perhaps 2 or 3 attack runs before exhausting their ammunition, potentially downing 3 or 4 aircraft if they were extraordinarily lucky. It would be like trying to stop an avalanche by throwing pebbles. He leveled off at 8,000 feet and scanned the night sky ahead. Searchlights were already probing the darkness to the southeast, their beams stabbing upward in crossing patterns designed to illuminate the bombers for the anti-aircraft batteries. But searchlight tactics were designed for finding individual aircraft or small formations. What happened when the sky was filled with them? Then he saw them. Even in the darkness, even at a distance of several miles, the sheer number of aircraft was visible as a mass of darker shadows against the night sky. But something was wrong. The bombers weren't at their usual altitude of 25,000 feet. Safely above most Japanese fighters. They were low, perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 feet, almost level with Nakamura's squadron. He could see them clearly now, dozens, massive 4-engine aircraft spread across the sky in a loose stream formation, navigation lights occasionally visible as they approached Tokyo from the southeast. The lead bombers were already over the city's outer districts. Nakamura banked hard toward them, his 5 wingmen following, but even as he closed for an attack run, he could see the bomb bay doors opening on the nearest B-29, And then he understood what he was seeing. Fire blossomed beneath the American bomber as the first cluster bombs tumbled into the night. Not the sharp flash of high explosives, but a spreading, almost beautiful cascade of flame, as dozens of individual incendiary bomblets scattered across a wide area. Then another bomber released and another, and suddenly the ground below was erupting in hundreds of points of fire, each point spreading rapidly as the napalm gel ignited wood and paper structures. Nakamura's training had prepared him to attack bombers, not to watch helplessly as they systematically turned his city into an inferno. He pressed his attack anyway, coming in from above and behind the nearest B-29, his machine guns and 20mm cannon spitting tracers into the American aircraft's fuselage. He saw his rounds impact, saw pieces fly from the bomber's tail section, but the massive aircraft simply absorbed the damage and continued on course. Its bomb bay was already empty. Whatever damage Nakamura inflicted now was meaningless. Those incendiaries were already falling. He pulled up and away, searching for another target, but everywhere he looked there were more bombers. They weren't flying in tight defensive formations like he'd been trained to expect. Instead, they came in a long stream, one after another, spread out over miles of sky. Even if every Japanese fighter in Tokyo managed to down a bomber, an impossible outcome, they couldn't possibly stop enough of them to matter. Below, in the Fukagawa ward of eastern Tokyo, Fire Warden Hiroshi Tanaka heard the whistle of falling bombs and shouted for his neighborhood team to take cover. They'd done this dozens of times before. Wait for the explosions, then emerge to fight whatever fires had started. But when the cluster bombs began detonating above the rooftops, releasing their payload of incendiary bomblets, Tanaka realized immediately that this was unlike any raid they'd experienced. The bomblets fell like burning rain, hundreds of them scattering across several blocks simultaneously. Each one that struck a wooden roof punched through and lodged itself inside, where the napalm gel ignited, at temperatures hot enough to ensure that even damp wood would catch fire. Within seconds, dozens of homes in Tanaka's district were burning from the inside out, and he could hear more bombs falling, could see the sky lit up with the cascading fire of more cluster bombs releasing their payloads across neighboring districts. "Water pumps!" he shouted to his team. "Quickly, before it spreads!" But even as his crew began working their hand-pumped fire engine, Tanaka could see it was already too late. The fires from the first wave of incendiaries were merging, growing, feeding on the densely packed wooden houses. And more bombers were overhead. He could hear the drone of their engines, could see the silhouettes of dozens of aircraft passing through the searchlight beams. More clusters were falling, spreading the fire faster than any human response could contain. In the Air Defense Command bunker, Captain Matsuda stared at the plotting table where his officers were desperately trying to track the developing catastrophe. The colored markers that represented bomber formations covered the entire map. His radar operators had stopped trying to count individual aircraft. The scopes were simply filled with returns, a solid mass of contacts stretching back 100 kilometers toward the Mariana Islands. "Sir, we have reports of fires breaking out across Fukagawa, Honjo, and Asakusa wards," a communications officer reported. "Fire brigades responding but report multiple simultaneous incidents. They're requesting additional units." "Send every available unit," Matsuda ordered, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. The reports coming in described not isolated fires, but entire neighborhoods igniting simultaneously. The American bombers weren't trying to hit specific targets. They were trying to burn the city itself. "Fighter squadrons report they're engaging, but making minimal impact," another officer called out. "The bomber stream is too dispersed. Pilots estimate the formations extend back." He paused, listening to his headset. "They estimate the formations extend back over 100 miles. Sir, They're asking for reinforcements from northern airfields. Send the request, Matsuda said. But they won't arrive in time. Lieutenant Yamamoto's radar screen had become almost useless. There were so many aircraft that individual returns were impossible to distinguish. The scope simply showed a solid band of contacts streaming toward Tokyo from the southeast, wave after wave after wave. He'd stopped counting after 200 aircraft. The number was academic now. Whether it was 200 or 300 or 400, the result was the same. Tokyo's defenses were being overwhelmed by sheer scale. Lieutenant, Matsuda said quietly, appearing at Yamamoto's shoulder. Your best estimate. How many aircraft have we faced? Yamamoto took a breath. Based on the radar returns, the duration of the stream, and the spacing between formations, I estimate a minimum of 250 to 300 aircraft have passed over the city. Possibly more. 300. The number hung between them. Japanese intelligence had estimated that the Americans might have 100 B-29s available for operations against Japan. The number attacking Tokyo tonight alone was 3 times that estimate, which meant either the intelligence was catastrophically wrong, or the Americans had been holding back on every previous raid, deliberately operating below their actual capability to disguise their strength. How? Matsuda said, not really asking Yamamoto, but asking the universe itself. How did we not know they had this capability? It was the question that would haunt Japanese military intelligence for the rest of the war. The B-29 program represented the largest aircraft production effort in history. Boeing, with its subcontractors and suppliers, had manufactured over 3,000 of these massive bombers. The cost exceeded $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project that would develop the atomic bomb. The industrial capacity required to produce the aircraft, train the crews, establish the bases, and support the logistics was staggering by any measure. But Japanese intelligence, operating from fragmentary information and constrained by their own assumptions about American capability, had systematically underestimated every aspect of the B-29 threat. They'd counted the aircraft visible on reconnaissance photos of Mariana's airfields and assumed those represented the total force available. They'd analyzed the payload and range of the bombers and concluded that massive simultaneous raids were logistically impossible. They'd observed the methodical, conservative approach of previous American raids and assumed that doctrine was driven by limitations rather than choice. Every assumption was wrong. The Americans hadn't been constrained by limited numbers of aircraft. They'd been refining their tactics, training their crews, building up their logistics. Tonight's raid wasn't a desperate gamble throwing everything available at Tokyo. It was a demonstration of capability, a message written in fire that said this is what we can do whenever we choose. Above the city, the bomber stream continued. The lead aircraft had already turned for home, their crews photographing the fires they'd started as they climbed away toward the safety of the Pacific. But behind them, more than 200 B-29s still waited their turn to drop their incendiary loads. The raid had been carefully planned to maximize destruction. The first waves had targeted the downwind edges of the designated fire zone, creating walls of flame that would then spread upwind through the target area. Subsequent waves dropped their incendiaries into the center of the zone, ensuring that fires would spread in all directions simultaneously. Brigadier General Thomas Power, flying in one of the lead aircraft, watched the fires spreading below and knew that Curtis LeMay's controversial tactical decision had been vindicated. LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, had ordered the low-altitude night incendiary attack over the objections of several subordinates who argued it was too risky. B-29s were designed for high-altitude operations, where their pressurized cabins and defensive armament could protect them from enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Flying at 5,000 to 7,000 feet made them vulnerable to everything from small arms fire upward. But LeMay had calculated that Japanese night fighter capability was limited, that low-altitude bombing would improve accuracy dramatically, and that incendiaries dropped in sufficient quantity on Tokyo's wooden buildings would create a firestorm that no defense could contain. He'd been willing to accept higher losses in exchange for catastrophic damage to Japanese industrial capacity and civilian morale. The losses weren't materializing. Japanese fighters were making attacks but couldn't concentrate their forces effectively against the dispersed bomber stream. Anti-aircraft fire was heavy but largely ineffective at the lower altitudes where the bombers were operating. Of the 334 aircraft attacking Tokyo tonight, only 14 would be lost to all causes, a casualty rate of just over 4%. For the level of destruction being inflicted, it was an extraordinarily favorable exchange ratio. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Fire Warden Hiroshi Tanaka had abandoned his water pump. The hand-powered equipment was designed to fight individual house fires, not a conflagration that now engulfed entire blocks. The heat was becoming unbearable. He could feel his skin blistering even at a distance from the flames. The fire was creating its own wind now, sucking air into the burning zones with such force that debris and sparks were flying horizontally through the streets. "Evacuate," he shouted to his team and to anyone who could hear. "Move toward the river. Get to the river." The Sumida River, which wound through eastern Tokyo, represented the only viable escape route for thousands of people trapped by the spreading fire. But the bridges were already clogged with refugees, and the riverbanks were packed with people who'd jumped into the cold water to escape the heat. Tanaka pushed through the crowds, helping an elderly woman who'd fallen, pulling a child out of the crush of bodies. Behind him, the fire was behaving in ways he'd never witnessed. The individual blazes had merged into a single vast inferno that was generating its own weather system. The tremendous heat was causing air to rise rapidly, creating a powerful updraft that pulled fresh oxygen into the fire at ground level. This created winds exceeding 40 miles per hour, strong enough to uproot trees and send sheets of burning material flying through the air. The fire was spreading faster than people could run. The temperature at the center of the firestorm was exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The asphalt in the streets was melting. Glass windows were softening and flowing like liquid. Metal objects were glowing red. And everywhere the wooden structures that comprised most of Tokyo were burning with an intensity that turned entire buildings into incandescent towers of flame within minutes. In the air defense bunker, the reports coming in had taken on a quality of desperation that Captain Matsuda had never heard before. Fire brigades were reporting that they'd lost contact with entire districts. Civilian defense coordinators were describing scenes of mass panic as people fled the spreading flames. Police units were requesting military assistance to maintain order at evacuation points. And still, the bombers kept coming. "Sir, we have fires reported across 16 square miles of the city," a plotting officer reported, his voice shaking. "Fukagawa and Honjo wards are completely engulfed. Asakusa ward is burning. Fires are spreading into Nihonbashi and threatening the central districts." 16 square miles. Matsuda tried to comprehend the scale. 16 square miles of densely populated urban area, home to perhaps 1 million people, was burning simultaneously. The fire breaks that were supposed to contain blazes between districts had been overwhelmed. Fires had simply jumped the wide boulevards, carried by wind-borne embers and the sheer intensity of the heat. "What's the status of the bomber formations?" he asked. "The lead elements have departed the area," Yamamoto reported from his radar station. but we're still tracking inbound formations. Sir, the raid has been ongoing for nearly 2 hours. They're still coming. 2 hours of continuous bombing. 2 hours of 300 aircraft dropping 7 tons of incendiaries each. Matsuda did the mathematics. Over 2,000 tons of napalm gel, millions of individual incendiary bomblets, scattered across the most densely populated sections of one of the world's largest cities. The fires those weapons had started would burn for days, but the decisive destruction, the transformation of living neighborhoods into charred wastelands, was happening in real time, neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, house by house. Flight Lieutenant Nakamura had exhausted his ammunition after 3 attack runs that had resulted in uncertain damage to 2 American bombers. He'd seen one of his wingmen go down, shot out of the sky by return fire from a B-29's defensive guns. The other 4 members of his squadron were scattered across the sky, each making individual attacks against the seemingly endless stream of bombers. He pulled up to 10,000 feet above the bomber altitude and simply looked at what was happening to his city. From this height, the scale of the disaster was fully visible. Tokyo spread out below him, and where eastern Tokyo should have been a sea of lights and shadows, there was instead a vast red-orange glow that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The fire covered an area he estimated at 15 or 16 square miles, an irregular shape that was still expanding as he watched. At the center, the flames were so intense they appeared white, and above them, a column of smoke was rising tens of thousands of feet into the night sky. He could see the B-29s silhouetted against the glow, still arriving in their steady stream, still dropping their incendiary loads onto a city that was already burning beyond control. He could see the futility of trying to stop them. 6 fighters against 300 bombers. Even if every fighter in Japan had been available tonight, even if they'd shot down 50 bombers, 100 bombers, it wouldn't have mattered. The Americans had brought enough aircraft to accomplish their objective with losses to spare. The realization that swept over Nakamura wasn't about this single raid, it was about the war itself. If the Americans could send 300 bombers against Tokyo tonight, they could send 300 tomorrow night, and the night after, and every night, until Japan's cities were ash. The industrial capacity required to build these aircraft, the logistical capability to base and supply them, the strategic patience to hold back their full strength until the moment of maximum impact. It spoke to an enemy whose resources were so vast that resistance might be literally impossible. He'd been taught that American soldiers were soft, that American industrial goods were inferior, that American resolve would crack when faced with Japanese fighting spirit. Every lesson of his training emphasized Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, as the decisive factor that would overcome any material disadvantage. But how do you defeat an enemy who can darken your sky with 300 bombers while your 6-fighter squadron exhausts its ammunition against them? On the ground, the fire had developed dynamics that transcended anything human planning had anticipated. The vast quantities of burning material were consuming oxygen faster than normal atmospheric mixing could replace it. This created a partial vacuum that drew air into the fire zone from all directions with hurricane force. People trying to flee found themselves literally blown off their feet by winds exceeding 50 miles per hour. Lighter individuals, particularly children, were picked up by the wind and carried into the flames. The Sumida River, which had represented safety to thousands of refugees, became a death trap as the firestorm's intensity grew. The water temperature was rising from the radiant heat of the surrounding fires. People who'd jumped in for safety found themselves being scalded. Those who tried to stay submerged to avoid the heat found there was no oxygen to breathe. The fire was consuming it faster than it could be replaced. Bodies floated in the river by the hundreds, by the thousands, refugees who'd reached apparent safety only to be killed by the secondary effects of the firestorm. In neighborhoods not yet reached by the flames, people made desperate choices about what to save and what to abandon. Family photographs, heirlooms, essential documents, all had to be weighed against the seconds available to escape. Many chose wrong, staying too long to gather possessions, underestimating how fast the fire would arrive. Others fled with nothing, running through streets lit by a hellish orange glow, ash falling like snow, the roar of the conflagration drowning out all other sound. The temperature at the center of the firestorm had reached the point where spontaneous combustion was occurring. Buildings not yet touched by flames simply erupted into fire from the radiant heat. People caught in these zones died almost instantly, their bodies consumed before they could even attempt to escape. The fire was creating its own rules now, a force of nature as unstoppable as a tsunami or earthquake, beyond any human capability to control or direct. At 3 hours and 14 minutes after the first bomber had reached Tokyo, the last B-29 of the attacking force turned for home, its bomb bay empty, its crew photographing the unprecedented destruction below. Behind them, 16 square miles of Tokyo was burning in a firestorm visible from 150 miles away, a glow on the horizon that American bomber crews would describe as looking like the sun rising at midnight. In the air defense bunker, Captain Matsuda stood at the plotting table, staring at the map where red markers now covered everything from Asakusa in the north to Fukagawa and Honjo in the east, spreading west toward Nihonbashi and south toward the Sumida River's mouth. 16 square miles. He kept coming back to that number. 16 square miles of the city he'd sworn to defend, burning beyond any hope of containment. Final bomber formations have departed Tokyo airspace, Lieutenant Yamamoto reported quietly. Sir, based on continuous radar tracking throughout the raid, I estimate the total attacking force at 330 to 340 aircraft. 334. That was the actual number, though Yamamoto couldn't know it precisely. 334 B-29s, carrying 2,400 tons of incendiaries, which had created a firestorm that would burn for another 48 hours and ultimately consume nearly 16 square miles of urban Tokyo completely. Matsuda looked at the report that had started this entire nightmare, the initial assessment from 3 hours earlier. 8B Nijukyu, it read. Standard approach pattern. Routine raid expected. 8 aircraft. They'd prepared for 8 aircraft. 334 had arrived. The discrepancy between those numbers represented more than a simple intelligence failure. It represented the collapse of every assumption that had governed Japanese military planning. If the Americans could send 300 bombers tonight, what could they send tomorrow? What did they have in reserve? How could Japan possibly defend its cities against an enemy with such overwhelming capability? These were questions that would occupy Japanese military planners for the remaining months of the war. Questions that ultimately had no satisfactory answers, because the truth revealed by the raid on Tokyo was simple and terrible. American industrial capacity was so vast that Japanese resistance was militarily meaningless. The Americans could make war on a scale that Japan couldn't match, couldn't counter, couldn't even adequately comprehend, until confronted with the physical evidence of 300 bombers turning Tokyo into an inferno. The dawn of March 10th, 1945, revealed what 3 hours of darkness had hidden from full view. Lieutenant Yamamoto emerged from the air defense bunker into a world transformed beyond recognition. The air was thick with ash and smoke, visibility limited to perhaps 100 yards. The smell was overwhelming, burned wood, rubber, and something else he didn't want to identify. A fine gray powder covered everything, settling on his uniform, his face, his hair, as if the city itself had been cremated and its ashes redistributed across the surviving districts. He walked east toward the Sumida River, following the streams of refugees moving away from the fire zone. Many were burned, their clothing charred, their exposed skin blistered and weeping. Others seemed physically unharmed, but moved with the blank expressions of profound shock, their minds unable to process what they'd witnessed. Children clung to parents who stared straight ahead, seeing nothing. Elderly citizens sat on the roadside, too exhausted to continue, waiting for help that might never come. At the river's edge, Yamamoto stopped and stared across the water toward what had been the Fukagawa district. Nothing remained. Where yesterday there had been neighborhoods extending for miles, homes, shops, temples, schools, the accumulated architecture of centuries, there was now a flat expanse of ash and twisted metal. Here and there, concrete structures stood like tombstones in a graveyard, their walls intact, but everything combustible burned away. The wooden buildings that had comprised 90% of the district were simply gone, reduced to ash so fine that the morning breeze was redistributing it across the ruins. The fire was still burning in places, though the firestorm itself had exhausted its fuel and collapsed sometime before dawn. Smoke rose from hundreds of small fires, scattered across the devastation, and in the distance, larger blazes still consumed whatever wooden structures remained at the edges of the burn zone. Fire brigades were finally able to approach the area, but there was little left to save. Their work now was recovery, not rescue. Fire Warden Hiroshi Tanaka had survived the night by staying submerged in the Sumida River with dozens of others, emerging periodically to gasp breaths of superheated air before ducking back under the water. His hands were badly burned from trying to help others onto the riverbank, and his lungs felt seared from breathing smoke and hot air. But he was alive, which made him one of the fortunate ones. As daylight grew stronger, he could see bodies everywhere. Along the riverbanks, in the water itself, floating downstream toward Tokyo Bay. Thousands of bodies of people who'd almost reached safety, but not quite. Many had drowned, overcome by exhaustion or smoke inhalation while in the water. Others had been trampled in the crush at the bridges. Still others bore no visible injuries, but had died from the heat or lack of oxygen, their bodies intact, but their lungs destroyed by inhaling superheated air. Tanaka tried to count the bodies visible from where he stood and gave up after reaching 200. And this was just one small section of the riverbank. The same scene was repeated for miles up and down the Sumida, and across the entire burn zone. Bodies lay where they'd fallen in numbers that would take weeks to fully count. The official estimates, compiled painstakingly over the following months, would conclude that approximately 100,000 people died in the raid on Tokyo the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945. Some estimates ranged higher, toward 130,000. The exact number would never be known because entire families had been consumed so completely that no one survived to report them missing. The Tokyo firebombing had become, in a single night, the deadliest air raid in human history, exceeding the death tolls of Dresden, Hamburg, or even the atomic bombings that would follow 5 months later. Captain Matsuda spent the day coordinating rescue efforts and compiling reports for military command. The statistics he was gathering painted a picture of devastation that exceeded even his worst fears during the raid itself. 16 square miles burned completely, an area representing roughly 15% of Tokyo's built-up urban core. More than 250,000 buildings destroyed, most of them residential. Over 1 million people rendered homeless. Industrial facilities across the eastern districts demolished. Transportation infrastructure, bridges, rail lines, roads, damaged or destroyed throughout the affected areas. But the numbers that haunted Matsuda most were the ones that revealed the catastrophic intelligence failure. 334 bombers. He'd confirmed the count through multiple sources: radar tracks, fighter pilot reports, debris from downed aircraft, and ultimately through captured American airmen who provided detailed information about the raid's composition. 334 B-29s had attacked Tokyo, dropping 2,400 tons of incendiaries in less than 3 hours. Japanese intelligence estimates had suggested the Americans might have 100 B-29s available for operations against the home islands. The actual attack force had been more than 3 times that number, which raised the terrifying question: if they'd sent 334 bombers last night, how many more did they have? The answer, which would become clear over the following weeks, was that the Americans had merely begun to demonstrate their capability. The raid on Tokyo wasn't a desperate gamble throwing every available aircraft at a critical target. It was the first of a sustained campaign. On March 11th, 2 nights later, 310 B-29s would strike Nagoya, Japan's second-largest industrial center. On March 13th, 274 bombers would attack Osaka. On March 16th, 307 aircraft would strike Kobe. In the span of 10 days, American bombers would drop over 9,000 tons of incendiaries on Japan's major cities, destroying 32 square miles of urban area and rendering homeless nearly 2.5 million people. And these raids represented only a fraction of the B-29 force available. The Americans were operating well below their maximum capacity, pacing their attacks to match the logistics of loading incendiaries, briefing crews, and analyzing results. Flight Lieutenant Nakamura returned to Yokota Airfield as the sun rose, his fuel nearly exhausted, his aircraft undamaged, but his ammunition expended. 4 of his 6 fighter squadron had made it back. 1 pilot was confirmed killed, shot down by defensive fire from a B-29. Another was missing, presumed crashed somewhere over the darkened countryside. The squadron's combat report documented 8 attack runs against American bombers, with claims for 2 aircraft damaged and 1 possibly destroyed. Set against an attacking force of over 300 aircraft, their efforts had been statistically meaningless. Nakamura wrote his report in mechanical detail, describing approach angles, ammunition expenditure, observed damage, all the technical details that higher command would want. But he couldn't bring himself to write what he really needed to say. We were irrelevant. They came in such numbers that nothing we did mattered. The realization that had struck him during the raid, that Japan was fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity made defeat inevitable, only deepened as reports came in throughout the day. 334 bombers represented an investment of roughly $500 million in aircraft alone, not counting the cost of training crews, establishing bases, stockpiling ordnance, and maintaining logistics. And the Americans had sent this massive force on a single raid against a single city, while simultaneously continuing their submarine blockade of Japan, supporting ground operations in the Philippines and Okinawa, and preparing for the invasion of the home islands. How do you fight an enemy who can afford to spend $500 million on a single night's bombing? The question had no answer that didn't end in Japanese defeat. In Washington, D.C., where it was still March 9th, military and civilians, leaders were receiving the first reports of the raid's success. The B-29 crews had reported extensive fires visible for over 100 miles on their return flight. Photo reconnaissance aircraft would later confirm that the raid had achieved unprecedented destruction, exceeding even the optimistic estimates of its planners. Curtis LeMay's controversial decision to switch from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks had been vindicated in the most dramatic terms possible. The strategic implications were immediately recognized. If American bombers could destroy 16 square miles of Tokyo in a single raid, they could systematically eliminate Japan's capacity to wage war by simply burning down its cities one by one. Japan's industrial production was already suffering from the American submarine blockade, which had reduced raw material imports to a fraction of peacetime levels. Now, even the factories that had raw materials could be eliminated through systematic firebombing. The combination of naval blockade and aerial bombardment was creating conditions that made Japanese surrender mathematically inevitable, regardless of how fiercely individual soldiers and civilians were prepared to fight. But there was another calculation being made in Washington during those spring months of 1945, a darker arithmetic about the invasion of Japan itself. Military planners estimated that a ground invasion of the home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties, possibly over 1 million if Japanese resistance matched the ferocity displayed on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. If strategic bombing could convince Japan to surrender before an invasion became necessary, it would save not only American lives, but ultimately Japanese lives as well, since a ground invasion would result in civilian casualties dwarfing even the most destructive air raids. This utilitarian calculus, kill 100,000 in a single raid to potentially save 1 million in an invasion, would shape American strategy for the remainder of the war. The Tokyo raid had demonstrated that such destruction was technically feasible. The question became whether it was morally acceptable, a question that military and political leaders would struggle with but ultimately answer in the affirmative. The bombing campaign against Japanese cities would continue and intensify, culminating 5 months later in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Lieutenant Yamamoto returned to the air defense bunker on the afternoon of March 10th, after spending the morning surveying the destruction. The concrete structure had survived undamaged. No bombs had fallen on this section of the city. But the command center felt different now, haunted by the knowledge of its own inadequacy. The radar screens that had tracked the approaching bombers, the plotting tables that had tried to coordinate defenses, the communication systems that had relayed orders to fighter squadrons. All of it had functioned exactly as designed, and none of it had mattered. Captain Matsuda was at his desk, working through reports that would be forwarded up the chain of command. He looked up as Yamamoto entered, and for a moment, neither man spoke. What was there to say? They had done their duties as trained, had responded according to doctrine, had made every decision correctly based on the information available, and the result had been catastrophe. The preliminary casualty estimates are over 100,000 dead, Matsuda said finally. Over 1 million homeless. 16 square miles of the city destroyed. He paused, then added, I counted 8 aircraft on my initial report. 8 aircraft seemed like a routine raid. Yamamoto nodded. He'd been thinking about those 8 aircraft all day, the initial radar returns that had seemed so manageable, so familiar. Sir, with respect, even if we'd known the actual number from the beginning, I'm not certain the outcome would have been different. What could we have done against 300 bombers? Our entire fighter defense of Tokyo amounts to perhaps 50 aircraft. Our anti-aircraft batteries were designed for much smaller raids. The civilian defense network was sized for peacetime fires, not a firestorm. I know, Matsuda said quietly. That's what makes it worse. We couldn't have stopped this, even if we'd known it was coming. The Americans have a capability that renders our defenses irrelevant. And if they can do this to Tokyo, they can do it to Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, every city in Japan. The realization hung between them. Not just that Japan had lost this battle, but that Japan was losing the war in a way that made military resistance increasingly meaningless. When your enemy can burn down your cities faster than you can evacuate them, when they can send 300 bombers and accept the loss of a dozen as an acceptable exchange ratio, when their industrial capacity is so vast that this massive raid represents a routine operation rather than a maximum effort, what does resistance mean? These were questions that Japanese military and civilian leadership would grapple with over the coming months. Some would argue for fighting to the bitter end, extracting maximum casualties from any American invasion in hopes of forcing a negotiated peace. Others would recognize that such resistance would only increase the total suffering while making the ultimate outcome no different. The debate would continue until 2 atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war finally forced acceptance of unconditional surrender. But on this afternoon of March 10th, standing in an air defense bunker beneath a city where 100,000 bodies lay cooling in the ruins, the intellectual debate about strategy seemed abstract and distant. Yamamoto thought about the 8 aircraft he'd reported, about the routine procedures he'd followed, about the moment when he'd realized that the scope of the attack was far beyond anything they'd prepared for. That moment of realization, when assumption collided with reality, had been the turning point, not of the raid, but of his understanding of the war itself. Fire Warden Hiroshi Tanaka spent 3 days helping to recover bodies from the ruins before exhaustion and his burns forced him to seek medical treatment. The scenes he witnessed during those days would stay with him for the rest of his life. Bodies burned beyond recognition, requiring identification through dental records or personal effects. Children found huddled together in air raid shelters, killed by carbon monoxide poisoning when the fires consumed all available oxygen. Families who'd almost reached safety, their bodies found mere feet from the river or from fire breaks that should have protected them. The psychological impact of the raid extended far beyond those who'd been in the fire zone. Tokyo's surviving population of more than 6 million people now knew that any night might bring another such attack. Air raid sirens that had previously prompted orderly movement to shelters now caused near panic, as people remembered the inadequacy of those shelters against incendiary bombs and firestorms. The government attempted to organize evacuations of non-essential civilians, but the scale of displacement overwhelmed available transportation and housing in rural areas. The psychological warfare value of the raid was as significant as the physical destruction. Every Japanese citizen now understood that American bombers could reach any part of Japan, could deliver destruction on a scale that made defense futile, and could do so repeatedly. The myth of the home islands as an impregnable fortress had been shattered as thoroughly as Tokyo's eastern districts. If Tokyo itself, the heart of the empire, defended by the strongest concentration of fighters and anti-aircraft guns in Japan, could be burned to ashes in a single night, what city was safe? The Americans understood this psychological dimension and exploited it systematically. Before subsequent raids, B-29s would drop leaflets warning specific cities that they were next on the target list, giving civilians time to evacuate, but also spreading terror to multiple cities simultaneously. Whether the Americans actually intended to bomb all the listed cities or not was irrelevant. The psychological effect of uncertainty was almost as valuable as the physical destruction of actual raids. Over the following months, American bombers would attack more than 60 Japanese cities, destroying through incendiary raids roughly 40% of the built-up area of Japan's urban centers. By the time of Japan's surrender in August, the strategic bombing campaign had rendered homeless between 8 and 9 million Japanese civilians, had killed between 300,000 and 500,000 people, and had reduced Japanese industrial production to a fraction of its wartime peak. But the raid on Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th remained the most destructive single conventional bombing raid in history. The 16 square miles burned, the 100,000 dead, the million homeless. These numbers represented a peak of destructive capability that wouldn't be exceeded until the atomic age. For Lieutenant Yamamoto, the raid became a dividing line in his life, before and after. Before, he'd been a competent officer doing his duty, confident in Japan's ultimate victory, certain that spirit and determination would overcome material disadvantages. After, he understood that some material disadvantages were simply too vast to overcome. The Americans hadn't won through better tactics or superior morale or more intelligent leadership. They'd won through sheer scale. So many bombers that defense was meaningless. So much ordnance that survival was largely random. So vast an industrial capacity that this massive raid was merely one operation among many. He continued serving in the Air Defense Command through the remaining months of the war, tracking subsequent raids on Tokyo and other cities, coordinating defenses that everyone knew were inadequate, writing reports documenting destruction that everyone knew would continue. The work had to be done and someone had to do it, but the certainty that had once animated his service was gone. When the war finally ended in August, after atomic bombs had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Yamamoto felt primarily relief that the destruction had finally stopped. Captain Matsuda remained at his post as well, though the psychological burden of March 9th weighed heavily on him. He had been responsible for Tokyo's air defense, and on the most important night, that defense had been revealed as wholly inadequate. It didn't matter that no defense could have stopped 300 bombers, or that the intelligence failure that underestimated American capability wasn't his fault. He'd been there, he'd watched it happen, and the knowledge that he'd been powerless to prevent it was its own form of trauma. In his private journal, found after the war, Matsuda wrote, "We prepared for the war we expected to fight, with the enemy we thought we understood, using the assumptions we believed were correct. Every assumption was wrong. The Americans didn't fight the way we anticipated. They had capabilities we didn't believe possible. They were willing to accept casualties we thought would deter them. And when all our assumptions proved false, we had no alternative strategy, no backup plan, no way to adapt quickly enough to matter. The war was lost, not in any single battle, but in the gap between what we believed and what was real. That gap, between Japanese assumptions about American capability and the reality of American industrial power, was perhaps the defining characteristic of the Pacific War's final year. Japan had entered the war believing that American resolve would crack under pressure, that American production couldn't match propaganda claims, that American soldiers would prove inferior to Japanese warriors. Each assumption had been tested against reality and found wanting. The raid on Tokyo was simply the most dramatic single demonstration of that reality. 8 aircraft expected, 334 arrived, routine raid anticipated, Firestorm delivered. Manageable damage predicted, 16 square miles burned. At every level, assumption collided with reality, and reality won decisively. Flight Lieutenant Nakamura survived the war and spent years afterward trying to reconcile his training with his experience. He'd been taught that Japanese fighting spirit would overcome any obstacle, that death before surrender was the ultimate honor, that Japan's cause was just and victory inevitable. But he'd seen 300 American bombers fill Tokyo's sky in a single night, and he'd understood in that moment that fighting spirit couldn't defeat industrial capacity on such a scale. In interviews conducted decades later, Nakamura would say, "We were brave, our pilots were skilled, our fighters were adequate for their purpose, but we were fighting an enemy who could afford to lose a dozen bombers in exchange for burning 16 square miles of Tokyo. And for them, that was an acceptable trade. They could replace those dozen bombers in a week. We couldn't replace the city at all. Once I understood that, I understood the war was lost, The only question was how much more we would suffer before admitting it. The psychological journey from confidence to doubt to understanding to despair that Nakamura and thousands of other Japanese military personnel experienced during the final year of the war represented a collective coming to terms with reality. Japan had started a war based on assumptions about relative capability that proved catastrophically wrong. The longer the war continued, the more obvious those errors became, until finally, after 2 atomic bombs demonstrated yet another dimension of American capability, continued resistance became literally unthinkable. The morning of March 10, 1945, when Lieutenant Yamamoto emerged from the air defense bunker to see Tokyo burning under a sky dark with smoke, represented one man's confrontation with that reality. He'd counted 8 aircraft and prepared for a routine raid. 334 had arrived and destroyed 16 square miles of his city in 3 hours. The gap between those numbers, between 8 and 334, between routine and catastrophic, between expectation and reality, told the story of Japan's war in miniature. American industrial capacity, revealed fully for the first time in the skies over Tokyo that night, proved to be exactly what propaganda had claimed, and exactly what Japanese intelligence had dismissed as impossible exaggeration. The United States had produced over 3,000 B-29s, had trained tens of thousands of aircrew, had established bases across the Pacific, had stockpiled millions of pounds of incendiary bombs, and had developed the logistics to sustain operations at a scale that Japan simply couldn't match or counter. This was the truth that Lieutenant Yamamoto confronted as dawn broke over the ruins of eastern Tokyo. This was the reality that Captain Matsuda had to incorporate into his reports to military command. This was the understanding that Flight Lieutenant Nakamura carried with him as he landed his fighter, ammunition exhausted, after a night of futile attacks against an overwhelming force. 8 aircraft expected. 334 arrived. The discrepancy between those numbers measured more than an intelligence failure. It measured the gap between 2 nations' industrial capacity, between confidence and reality, between the war Japan thought it was fighting and the war it actually faced. And on the morning of March 10th, as Tokyo smoldered under a pall of smoke visible for 100 miles, that gap finally became impossible to ignore. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.